this session, we are going to see how we can work with partition in Hive database. So let's see first what is partition in Hive. The main task of Hive partition is similar to the SQL partition, but there is a difference between SQL partition and Hive partition is like SQL partition only supports single column, but in Hive partition we can have multiple columns which can work as a partition column. Hive partition also can be worked with both the tables, that is managed table and external table. And also we say if we are not using any partition, then Hive also create by default static partition when the table is created. So we can say like Hive supports multiple column partition and it could be worked on both the tables, that could be managed table as well as external table. So let's see which all types of partition are available in Hive. Basically we can say there are two types of partition that are available in Hive database. The first one is static partition and the second one is dynamic partition. So static partition is when we know like which column we are going to declare as a partition column. Like we know in advance like which data we are going to load and what is our partition column. For this we need to set a property that is Hive exec dynamic partition mode equal to strict. But for this, if we are not setting this property or we are not creating any partition, then we say that the static partition is by default available in partition. The second type of partition is the dynamic partition. So the dynamic partition is where we don't know the columns in which we don't know the values of that column, like on which we are going to partition our data. So for this we need to set couple of properties that are the same one for the static partition, but here we need to set the mode to non-strict instead of strict, which we set in static partition. And also we need to set the dynamic partition equal to true. So we have two type of partition available in Hive, the static partition and the dynamic partition. For the static partition we can say it is a default partition and we know which data we are going to partition. So when we are trying to load our data into table, then we specify the column because we know in advance our data type and our column which we are going to partition. So that's why we called it as static partition, where we know in advance. But in dynamic partition we don't know the value of the columns, so we need to set the property to non-strict and dynamic property dynamic partition equal to true. So let's see this in terminal, how we create dynamic partition and how we create this static partition and what is the difference for these two type of partition. So this is my terminal in which the Hadoop and Hive is available. So let's verify if my Hadoop is running or not. As we know, to start with Hive queries, we should have Hadoop running mode. So as you can see, when I have executed the JPS command, then my Hadoop daemons are displaying. So we can say my Hadoop is up and running. So let's start with Hive. I have typed Hive and press enter. So now my Hive is getting started. So in this we are going to see how we can create static partition. So my Hive is started. So to start with your queries, first you need to set the database, like which database you are going to use for your query creation. So let's see which all database I have. Show databases. Now you can see I have these many databases available in my Hive. So let's use any of them. So use, then database name. Let's say I'm using testing 10. So now I am using testing 10 database for my query creation. So let's first create our static query, which is used for static partition. So as we know, to start with static partition, we need to use the partition mode to strict. So I have used partition mode equal to strict to start with my static partition query. I have pressed enter. So my partition mode is strict. So let's create with Hive query for static partition. So I have used this query for my static partition table creation. So I have used create table, then I have taken the table name. So let's see, create table, then the table name, let's say employee 1. Then I have two field, that is ID int and name as string, partitioned by department. To create your query as a static partition, you need to define a partition column, and that partition column should not be used when you are creating the schema of your table. For example, I cannot use department string over here. So let's see, I have used department as a string over here. So it will give me an error that you cannot use like this. So let's say first I can execute this query so that we can see the error, and then partitioned by department, row format, delimited, terminated by tab. So my data would be tab separated. So let's press enter. So now you can see this is the error which is coming column repeated in partitioning column. So you cannot repeat your column for the partition column which is used in your table creation. So that is why I have not used department string here when we are creating our table schema. So I have two columns, that is ID and name, and partitioned by department. So any data when we load for this, that would go in this department which will be used when we are loading our data. So now my employee 1 table has been created. If I use select star from, let's say, table name, that is employee 1, it will not going to show anything because I have not loaded the data. But now if you want to see the schema of your table, then you can use DESC describe, then the table name, that is employee 1, semicolon, enter. So now you can see I have created this one because I have one column as a partition column, so that's why it is displaying over here 3 columns. But I have created the schema for 2 columns because you have to define one partition column also, so that's why it is displaying department as well, and also the department column here in partitioned information as well. So now your data would be loaded on the basis of this partition column, that is department. So let's first create the data for this table, that is ID and name. So I have created one data that is for our static partition. Let's see what is available in that. So now you can see it has only ID and name. This is static1.txt and it is separated by tab. So let's load this data in our table. So I have used load data local in path, then in the inverted commas the path of that file, that is static1.txt, into table and then table name, table 1, the table name is employee, and partition we have to define. The partition is the department would be admin. So whatever data I am loading now, that would come under admin department. So as for the static partition, we are aware, we know in advance which data we are going to load for which column. So that's why we are defining that this all data will go in the department for the admin. If I press enter, then my data would be loaded in this table with department as admin. So let's query this data. Select star from employee 1. Now you can see my data is loaded with admin. So all my employees are with admin department. So because in static partition we know the static partition data in advance, so that's why we load our data with that partition only. So when I have loaded my data, I have loaded with department as admin. So that's why it is loaded all the records with admin department. Now let's verify this in the cluster of HDFS where this is loaded. So let's open that URL. I'm refreshing this because it is loaded in user local warehouse. So user hive warehouse, and then our database is testing 10, which we have used when we have created that. So testing 10, and inside testing 10 we have our table employee 1. So this is employee 1, and because we have loaded our data with department equal to admin, so that's why it is displaying over the admin, and then our data file. So this is our data file. You can download this and save, and once it is saved you can verify the complete data. So this is our data, the same data we have loaded like this. So in the right tab I have the downloaded data which is similar to the loaded data, but the main difference now is I have loaded my data with admin department. So when I try to query my table, then it would display all the columns like department as well. So now you can observe how the static partition works. In static partition, we know our data in advance, so we create our data in the similar manner. The main thing is when we load our data, then we know in advance, like we are loading our department which is admin, so we load our all the data with admin department. So this is how the static partition works. In the dynamic partition, we are not aware of this partition data, so we would not load our data like this. So we are going to cover the dynamic partition in our upcoming session. This session we are going to cover the dynamic partition, how we can create dynamic partition in Hive, and how we can verify if my dynamic partition is created or not. So basically the dynamic partition is where we are not aware of the data of our partitioned column. Like I have the country for my dynamic partition, but I'm not aware of how many countries data is available in my data. So we only create the partitioned column as country, and it would be further divided into different countries based on my data. So let's start with the dynamic partition creation. So as we know, first we need to verify if our Hadoop is running or not for my Hive creation. So let's verify using JPS command. So now you can see my JPS shows all the daemons are running for my Hadoop. So let's start with Hive. I have typed Hive and press enter. So now you can see my Hive is running now. So first, to create any query, you need to choose a database where you want to create your Hive query. So to choose your database, you need to execute the query show databases. By using this, by using show databases, it will display all the databases that are available in your Hive. As you can see, I have these many databases available. So let's use the same database which I have used for my static partition creation time. So let's use testing 10 database. So use testing 10 semicolon enter. So now you can see I have used testing 10 for my query creation. So you can get all your tables using show tables inside this database. So I have these many databases, these many tables available in my testing 10 database. So let's create a dynamic partition query for this database. As we know, to create a dynamic partition, we need to set the partition mode to non-strict and the dynamic partition should be true. So let's set these properties first to create the dynamic partition. So let me clear my screen first. To clear the screen, the command is explanation sign clear and semicolon. So now I have cleared my screen. So let's first these two properties for my dynamic creation, that is strict mode and then partition. So the first thing is I need to set the partition mode to non-strict. This is used when you are going to create your dynamic partition. If you have not set this property, then you cannot create your dynamic partition and it will go to your static partition mode only. So I have set this property. I have to set one more property, that is partition equal to true. So this is set hive exec dynamic dot partition equal to true, semicolon, enter. So now you can see I have set both the properties for my dynamic creation. This is needed to create your dynamic partition query. So let's create a dynamic partition query first. That is, first you need to create a table that is needed for your dynamic partition. So I have used this partition table for my dynamic partition creation. So create table, then partition name. So let's make it dynamic partition. Dynamic partition. Then I have 4 fields, that is ID, name, country and then company. So I have 4 columns in my table. Then partitioned by, I need to create a partition column to execute that. So I'm taking as an alias for country, that is country underscore part, that is used for country partition, and then clustered by company. So that will be clustered by a company differently. So let's say I have different companies data available, then it will include one company for one country and it will load into 5 buckets. So buckets we will see in our upcoming sessions when we create the bucketed table, and this is how you create that, and we will see what is bucket in our next session. And used row format delimited field by tab. So I have pressed enter, so you can see my table is created. You can see show tables will display my dynamic partition. So this is the first which is created. If you want to view the schema of this table, then DESC dynamic partition. So now you can say similar to that, it has created ID, name, country, company, and because I'm creating a dynamic partition, so I have taken a alias for the country, that is country part, and the alias will used for my data creation when we are going to load our data from the temporary table that is used for a dynamic partition creation time. So you can see the partition information is country part. So I'm loading my data based on the country partition. So the next step is to create a temporary table, because that is used for my data load when we are going to insert the data from temporary table to our actual partition table, that is dynamic partition. So the temporary table has the similar schema as it is in the actual partition table. So create table, the table name, let's say I'm taking temporary 2, then the same schema, ID, name, country, company, then row format, delimited field, terminated by tab. So now I have created our temporary table as well. Now I have to load the data, the actual data into this temporary table, and after that it is loaded into temporary table. So on the basis of the partition, we will load our data to the actual partition table, that is dynamic partition. Because of the temporary table that is needed for dynamic partition, we load our data using this table only, that is temporary table. So the next step is to load the data into our temporary table. So to load the data into temporary table, it is the same schema file, that is the same command, that is load data local in path, and then the path of that data file into table, and then the table name, that is temp2. So let me show you the data which is in the dynamic.txt, dynamic1.txt. So this is the data that is used in dynamic1.txt. You can see it has ID, then the name of the employees, then the country. I have used 5 country: India, US, Japan, England, China, and then the different companies, company 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is the data available to load for our dynamic creation. Because of we don't know the all the countries available for this data, so that's why we used to create the dynamic partition, and we load into temporary table, and then we load into our actual partition. So let's move to our terminal. So load data local in path, then the path of that file, and then into table temporary 2. So now you can see it is loaded in our temp2. You can view this into temp2 table. Select a star from temp2. Temp2 will show you all the data. So don't bother about these null values. These null values, as we are already aware, if you have any new line available after entering your data in the text file, it will come as a null. So because I have 2 lines, so that's why it is null. If you don't want this, you can delete that and press the cursor and then save again. Let me save again, and let's load that data again, but it will load twice. So you first need to drop that table, temp table, and you need to load the data again. So let me show you this also, so that you can use in your further projects. So let's drop this temp table, drop table, then table name, that is temp2. I have pressed enter. So it is from, so let's use drop table temp2. So now you can see my temp2 is dropped. If I use select star from temp2, it will show like the table is not available, table not found. So let's create the table again. Create table temp2 in the similar manner. It is created. Now just load the data. Load data local in path, the same data, then temp2. So now you can verify how you can drop the data table, and again you create the table, again you load the data in a similar way. If I use select star from temp2, then you will get the actual data, and now you see there is no null value because I have removed the extra lines that are available in our data file. So now your temporary table data is ready. Now you can move this data to your actual partition column. So let's use how you load your data in your actual partition table. So let's use, because our table name for the actual partition is dynamic partition. So dynamic partition is equal to country part, as we have already created in that. Then the same all table that is available in temporary, you can verify that this is loading the data from our temporary table. So select ID, name, country, company, country, and because country is as a country partitioned column, so we have to use that as well. Because of this only it will load into the partitioned column, and then from temp1. So let's press enter. Now the map reduce job will start, and it will load the data from the temporary table to actual partitioned table with the partition mode. So as it is a dynamic partition, you have to create a temporary table that has a similar schema, and because you have one country and because you have one column that is for partition column, so you have to use the areas for that column to load the data into the actual partition column. So to create a dynamic partitioned query, there are few steps which you can see here also. Like first, you need to set the properties, like these properties in your Hive, that is partition mode is equal to non-strict and the partition is equal to true. And after that you have to create first the partitioned column. Then the second step is to create a temporary table and load the data into temporary table, and from that temporary table you have to load that in your actual partitioned column, actual partitioned query, partition table you can say. So let's see if our data has loaded or not. Now it is executing the map and reduce job. So once the reducer is 100%, then it will display you OK. The mapper is already executed. Now the reducer is also executed. So our partition is created. So now you can verify, because I have 5 countries, so it is created the different partition: India, US, Japan, England, China. So I have 5 partition column. So I have the data that is partitioned into 5 countries, and my data is available according to our data in these 5 partition. So if you want to execute the query for one particular partition you can execute in the similar manner. Let's say select star from the partition and then the partition condition. So let's say I'm executing select star from dynamic partition where the country partition is, let's say, USA. It is a case sensitive, so if you execute capital USA, so it will not display you anything. It is only displaying OK, but you can't get any data. So as it is a case sensitive, you have to use according to your data. As my data is in small characters, so you have to use a country partition is equal to small characters like USA. So now you can see my 3 rows are from USA, so my data is displayed over here. If you similar way, if I use country code equal to India, then it will display me the data which is available from India only. So here in the dynamic partition you can verify the data based on the partition that you are not aware of, because I have created the data on the country column, and let's say my data is from 100 countries, so it will automatically create 100, you can say, folders or partition for your data insertion, and only those data that is for particular country that will go into that country partition only. So this is how you create your dynamic partition. In a similar way, you can verify this in your partition on your URL also. So let's see. Because my data is in the testing 10 database only and my table is dynamic partition. So let's see dynamic partition, and we have these many partition like China, England, India, Japan and US. If you click on a particular data, that you will get the all 5 buckets, because when you have created the table we have defined as 5 buckets, so that's why it is created in 5 buckets, and in one of bucket the data is there. Now you verify the 66 byte, so this partition has the data, the actual data you can say. So you can click on this, you can download, save, close, and you can verify the data in this. So now you can see, because it is the India data, so that is showing the data for the India only, as we have used the country code for the partition as India. So you can verify how your partition works. So partition is similar, like it is divided your data into different partition, and as you are not aware of how many countries are there, so that's why we use as a dynamic partition. In dynamic partition your data actually goes to that partition which it belongs. So this is how the dynamic partition works.